All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 22, The Early Industrial Revolution, 1760 to 1851. We've got Section 3, The Impact of the Early Industrial Revolution. So, the impact that the revolution had was pretty significant. We already talked a little bit about the economics, that essentially it was more goods for cheaper prices, right? That's what the steam engine did, going from making everything with your hands to making things in a factory using mass production and steam power, more goods and cheaper prices. However, it also had a significant impact on society. The emergence of industrial cities was a massive consequence of the Industrial Revolution. In all cities that went through the industrial period, population growth occurred significantly and exponentially. London became the world's largest city ever. During the industrial period, 2.5 million people lived in London. And essentially what happened was that in these cities, the factories were built that, of course, could provide jobs. So this might be London with the factories. And all the surrounding towns in which were rural and agricultural, because factories were so expensive to build, it's not like, you could build a factory in every town. And so people moved to the cities immediately to find jobs working in these factories. And that led to huge population growth, and it happened very rapidly. However, many of these cities were not prepared for this huge influx of population. And there were enormous amounts of problems that occurred, including no sewage system, right? So including sewage and trash, no systems to get rid of this. Human waste was simply just either thrown in the streets or thrown in the rivers. Garbage was typically thrown just in the streets. So there was no systems in place yet in a lot of these early cities. A lot of people brought their animals with them into the cities, which made things like disease and health all the more problematic. Pollution, right, especially from coal burning plants, right? And so the coal burning plants put up a lot of soot. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for the skies in these cities to be sort of this hazy, smoky, dark color, or even experience acid rain as a result of some of the pollution. Because there were no systems put in place, a lot of times the water supply was contaminated, and as a result, cities were a hotbed of disease. Many people died as a result of this. And we could look at all of these things together: the sewage, the trash, the animals that are living side by side with people, the pollution, the contaminated water, the spread of disease. All of these things can, we can just characterize them as cities of being an area with poor health, right? All of these things are related to health. Life expectancy was generally lower in the earliest cities than it was in the countryside for some of these general reasons. We might just say the general unpleasantness, right? Just think about something like the smell of these cities, and even some of the psychological impact of living in these areas. So these early cities like London, Manchester, Liverpool, a lot of problems with overcrowding, a lot of problems with disease, a lot of problems with general poor health. Meanwhile, in the rural environments, the impact of the Industrial Revolution led to deforestation, that is the cutting down of what we might call the forest, and mining significantly altered the landscape. Mountains, hills, rocks were blown up in search of copper, in search of coal, in search of iron. All these materials that were now being used in an exponential rate led people to go out into the rural environments, cut down every single tree, blow up every mountain in search of these valuable natural resources that fueled the industrial period. So we might say the fuel for industrialism. Meanwhile, when it came to actually working in the factories. Working conditions, we could say, were very poor. Machines or the factories required unskilled labor. This typically meant that anybody / everybody could work in the factory. And just as a simple, as a simple equation of supply and demand, if the number of people who can work in the factory is exponentially high, then the price you have to pay them goes down. And so low wages were very much characteristic of factory work. Because it was unskilled work, repetition was the name of the game. Very boring, we might say. Machines did most of the work. This might just recall you or demand that you push a button over and over again. And the machines did all the rest. Work days were very long, 16 hours a day. You could imagine the type of toll that would play on a person just having to push a button 16 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. Work was dictated by the factory clock. So this wasn't just true of work life, but this was also true in a sense of home life. Really before the industrial period, work life was controlled really by the natural world. So in a sense, when a farmer started work was when the sun came up, and that was a way of the natural world dictating how to work. When it was the winter time, farmers didn't do that much work. When it was the fall time for harvest, farmers did a lot of work. The steam engine doesn't care about that, right? The steam engine doesn't care if it's summer or winter, doesn't care if it's morning, noon, or night, and really doesn't care if it's light out or it's dark out. And so people's lives became really dictated by the clock. And this is certainly a consequence of industrialism that we still very much live with today. Our entire lives today are dictated by the clock, and that was in part due to the industrial period. Industrial accidents were high. The factories were very dangerous, and there was very little to no protection for workers, right, as a result. And if someone was injured on the job in the industrial period, there's no unemployment insurance, there was no workman's comp, there were really no safety precautions. And it happened very, very often, so much so that people could die or even lose their limbs while working in these factories. Also, the nature of work changed in terms of families. Now, typically, families on the farm worked together. Everybody in the family was required to work. However, typically in industrial societies, families were separated. Typically, husbands, we might say men, women, and children might all work, but they might all work in separate jobs or separate factories. So in a sense, the industrial period helped to break apart families. Child labor was very high. In fact, children could, again, the unskilled jobs, children could pretty much do anything an adult could do, but they could be paid much less. And in fact, one of the very first efforts to try to reform the workplace during the industrial period is an effort to try and get rid of child labor. Some of the very first labor laws, some of the very first safety requirements in the workplace are those that protect children first and then go on and extend to men and women afterwards. Meanwhile, in other places like the United States, the Cotton Kingdom, so the Cotton Kingdom is the southern US, which used African slave labor in order to harvest that cotton. Because the factories require and need more cotton to produce more finished good, because inventions like the cotton gin make removing the seeds much easier, slavery expanded significantly in the United States between around 1790 and the American Civil War, 1860. So the Cotton Kingdom and slavery, southern United States expanded greatly. Unlike other parts of the Atlantic world, which utilized slave labor historically, for example, we had talked about Brazil and Jamaica and Barbados and Cuba, Haiti, those islands used slave labor to produce sugar. The one thing that made the southern United States different than other areas of the Atlantic world that used slavery was the amount of land that was required. And cotton required a lot more land than sugar, for example. And that's one of the reasons why it expands significantly in the US. In terms of society, as a result of the industrial period, people bought more goods. Generally speaking, we could say the material standard of living. That means the food that people eat, the clothes that they wear, the home that they live in, the various consumer goods that are available to them increased significantly. And that was a lot to do with the amount of production that was occurring and the cheaper prices which were occurring. Even though a lot of the industrial cities created a lot of health hazards and health problems, right? You can kind of see all the smoke going up in this illustration of an industrial city here. You could only imagine how polluted this river must be. That would be the same water source that people would drink from. Cholera outbreaks, rickets outbreaks, all these different diseases decimated the population. But in the long term, access to better quality goods, more goods, increased material standard of living in the long run. Things like famines, for example. Famines were very, very common prior to 1700. In industrial societies, famines really ceased to be a major issue because any geographic area that experiences a shortage of food or experiences a significant limitation in the food they can produce, food can be transported via railroad, via steamship in a way that that can benefit them. Now, famines still occur in non-industrial areas. It's only ones that have access to things like steamships and things like railroads. An entire new class emerges, the entrepreneur class. So when we look at this, these are people who were rich from industrial society. We might call them the factory owners, right? And, they joined the previous landed nobility, the merchant class, right? So think about those who traded, and the industrialists. And even though some of these industrialists were new to this sort of elite wealthy class, they often worked with the old traditional nobility. They worked with the merchants to get money to fund things like factories. On top of that, especially in middle class, there was a distinct division of labor between men and women. The cult of domesticity is sometimes used to describe the culture of men being in the public and women in the domestic. Now, it's very important that this was mostly true of the middle class. And this is where a lot of stereotypes regarding the proper role of men in society is and what the proper role of women in society is. And according to the cult of domesticity, which was enforced through laws, through literature, through culture, that men were only allowed to have a role in the public arena, whereas women were relegated only to the domestic arena. This was a culture that was in Great Britain and England at the time, but also spread to other areas like the United States and other places in Europe, and would be something that women's rights advocates would continue to fight against to expand and change the role in which society dictates where they play. Mary Wollstonecraft created what's considered the first feminist manifesto to advocate for women's rights, called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. We might call this the first feminist manifesto. And she would go on to inspire many women who sought to challenge this notion of the cult of domesticity.